So here we are now in our final session together. Thanks for joining me again, and I hope this may be of some help to you in some way. Yeah, there's no easy answers about sexual feelings and how all the different situations we were looking at have developed. There's no easy answers. As I've said before, many times people try to produce a blueprint about how someone develops sexually, and there may be some truth in it. And for some people, that will be a thing that they can connect with it. But for many more, probably, it's not been their experience. But there is usually a common factor, and that's low self-worth. I suppose in all my experience, I would say that is maybe one of the biggest human problems, often expressed in ways that look as if they're saying the opposite. In other words, somebody who appears to be very dynamic and charismatic might, underneath all that, bitterly find it difficult to believe that they're loved and accepted. So I think I've learned, and I'm sure that's justified, not to judge by first appearances, whether someone feels comfortable with who they are or whether they don't. But each one of us, of course, has a unique experience of life, stating the obvious. And therefore our responses to whatever happens in our lives is unique as well. So what affects one person will not necessarily affect somebody else. One thing that I do feel strongly is that our sexual feelings are very closely linked with our emotional feelings and needs. And therefore, if we're going to understand something more about how our sexual feelings and desires develop, then I think it's important to understand more about how our emotional feelings develop in different ways. And of course, as we've already said, sexual attractions don't necessarily conform to the social norms of what is attractive. You know, we're often encouraged to believe that this person is attractive or that person isn't attractive or whatever. It's different for everyone. You know, the attractiveness doesn't conform to social needs. But it does affect the way we relate to somebody. We've got to be honest about that. It's much easier for me to love someone who is attractive, whether it's physically or emotionally or whatever, than it is for someone who appears to be unattractive to me personally. But of course, I have to make choices about that, and therefore, I may have to learn how to love a person who I don't immediately find to be attractive in some way or another. Very complex area, isn't it? And I guess for many people, I'm stating what's blatantly obvious. So sometimes identifying a possible emotional feeling or need which has then become sexualized in a sense, will encourage some change, but sometimes it won't. Maybe it doesn't need to be changed. That's a choice up to the individual, isn't it? But sometimes a sexual feeling or desire, or an emotional feeling or desire that has become sexualized, may be something that the person is not happy with. And therefore, it may be something that the person can seek change for. But in order to do that, I think, an important part of that process is going to involve discovering where that feeling has come from. What is the emotional need that the person is seeking to express in that? So some understanding of what my sexual feelings and what other people's sexual feelings may be saying must be helpful. And I believe as a Christian, of course, the need of receiving God's love and knowing that the Creator loves us and accepts us unconditionally, and knowing his love and forgiveness for me as a Christian is very important, of course, in that kind of process. So where do we begin in trying to learn more about how we develop sexually? Well, right from the moment of conception, I believe we're receiving messages about ourselves, about other people, and about the world in which we live. I find myself that's a helpful way of looking at this kind of process in terms of what messages did I receive about myself when I was young. Did I believe I was loved? Did I believe I was loved unconditionally? Did I not believe I was loved? Did I believe that I fitted in, that I belonged? Or maybe I didn't feel that. What was going on? What kind of messages were I receiving? Now, obviously, the most significant relationships in terms of people who are giving us those messages are going to be our own family or our peer group when we're very young. They're going to be very important messages. So for some, we will have more of a positive family background than others. And also very significant emotional events that have happened in all sorts of different ways. They could be everyday occurrences like a bereavement or being hurt or some experience of shock or trauma, or it could be, of course, abuse in our lives, whether that's emotional abuse or sexual abuse. And as we saw in our case study with Simeon, for example, he would, I suppose in a way, find it very difficult to believe that his early relationships as a child were wrong. What he experienced in those relationships were wrong. Many people who've been sexually abused as children are clearly traumatized by that and therefore clearly seeing themselves as a victim, and they've been abused in a wrong way, of course, and that has had its dramatic effects on their lives. But I've met some people who, although they were in a sense, if you like, legally abused by somebody who was older than themselves as a child, because of the quality of the relationship, they find it difficult to identify it as abuse. But it is, of course, abuse. I think the other thing we have to recognize is that no matter how our sexuality has developed in all sorts of different ways, we then have choices about how we're going to express it. And in some situations, of course, you're dealing with someone who is maybe has got quite an evil kind of personality in one way or another, a very bad personality. I mean, obviously there's question marks about whether that can be redeemed or changed. I believe as a Christian it always can. But sometimes you may be dealing with what we would term a wicked situation or a wrong situation or an evil situation. Those are the ones that often make the headlines. But that isn't true for every person who's involved in sexual behaviour that we believe to be wrong in that sense. Sometimes, of course, we've got human nature to deal with as well, and of course that's a big factor as well. So, in some cases, of course, of abuse of one kind or another, the victim of the abuse is murdered. The person is a murderer, is a killer. We can't say that. In a sense, we're not recognizing that for what it is. Of course, it's an evil situation. But not everybody is coming from that kind of background. Those evil situations are the ones that usually make the headlines. So sometimes now the way we believe ourselves, what we believe now about ourselves, sometimes in a sense seeks expression through our sexuality. More so for some people than others, of course. And therefore, and the reason, I suppose, one of the important reasons that I like to look at this issue is because it may therefore be telling us something important and valuable about ourselves. It may be telling us something that we've believed which isn't true. Maybe a lie, more often than not in my experience, it's a lie. Certainly if it's telling us that we're unacceptable, that we don't belong and that we don't matter, of course that's a lie. That's wrong. And that needs to be changed. So sometimes it needs to be changed, maybe sometimes not. Well, having said all that, now let's look at a few of what we often term as sexual fetishes. As I said earlier, I think It's often argued that we all have sexual fetishes. If a fetish is something that you desire to do sexually or a sexual feeling that you have. But let's look at some common ones. And again, I'm probably stating the obvious and the familiar to many people. First of all, sadism, desire to punish someone. And then, of course, masochism, the desire to be punished. Now, again, very often it's seen in permissive society that this kind of behaviour by some would be seen as perfectly okay, and the feeling often portrayed is that the person has chosen this for themselves and sought to do this for kicks. But I don't think it's as simple as that. I don't think a sadist or a masochist has actually chosen to be a sadist or masochist. They've certainly chosen how they may want to express it. But deep down, I think it's saying something about the way they feel about themselves. If the person wants to punish somebody else and that desire has become sexualized, or if the person wants to be punished, then it's not as simple as saying, well, that's a sexual kick, is it? There must be something else going on underneath the surface in that kind of situation. Then there's transvesticism. We've already looked in our case studies. Do you remember at the guy who had transvestite issues? And that's Derek, of course, who had transvestite issues, and nobody knew about it. And again, as was shared in the kind of case study, transvesticism is a male desire. I've never heard of a woman who's a transvestite. It always seems to be a male issue, but it's a male desire to dress in female clothing, but it's usually erotic. It's usually quite strongly sexual, and therefore the clothing concerned is usually something that gives a message of being sexual, like under female underwear or something like that. It's usually that. It's not always that, but it's usually that. And it's a male desire, but the person is usually, as again we mentioned in the case study, the man is usually fantasizing that he is, in a sense, becoming the woman that he would like to feel he is exciting sexually, stimulating sexually. It's not always as straightforward as that, but in my experience, that's often the way it is. Many people would say to me that it was like I was looking down on myself with somebody else, and it becomes strongly sexualized, strongly erotic. So it's usually associated with an orgasm, with masturbation or something like that, but not necessarily always, but usually. But again, the transvestite will normally say that they don't want to become a woman, and they don't feel that they are a woman. They are in fact becoming the woman that they would like to feel they could please sexually. Now it's interesting because it's very often argued that the person that we're attracted to sexually, in some cases, is sometimes the person or the qualities that the person has that we would like ourselves. I've heard that said several times, that the person we're attracted to often has that dimension to it. Of course, not always, but sometimes. So in transvesticism, that's the usual kind of situation, but the transvestite, in a sense, doesn't want to necessarily live like that. And having said that, of course, there are transvestite clubs where people will usually pay somebody who will make them up as a woman, and they become a woman for a day kind of thing. In a way, that's a simple way of looking at it, but something like that. And sometimes there's a sort of kick out of getting that. Again, that's sounds a little bit borderline, doesn't it, between transvesticism and transsexualism? But sometimes that's the situation. It's all very different for different people. Then there's a fetish that I've come across a few times where somebody finds particular types of clothing very sexual, very, very arousing sexually, usually by wearing the clothing or touching it. In one case that I came across, it was where the person loved or it was excited by touching leather or by denim, and even more excited sometimes if he would actually wear the clothing and it would become sexually stimulating. But then when we started talking about this situation, it turned out that in everyday life, his clothes are very formal. And his parents had always encouraged him to dress smartly, and that clothing like denim or anything like that was regarded as being infra dig, not very good. I think his family might have been coming from a military kind of background as well. So that was the strong message he was receiving as a young person, that the only clothing that was acceptable was the suit and tie kind of thing. And that may be more unusual these days, of course, but that was the situation in this person's experience. And I think that must have been a factor that had encouraged that person to develop this fetish for being sexually stimulated by clothing like leather or denim. He often used to secretly order it online and then hide it, whereas most people would have a problem with doing that. They'd have leather and denim clearly on display in their wardrobe or whatever. We all do. But for this person, no. That was a no-no, so it was a secret thing, and it had become very sexualized. Sometimes, of course, the clothing fetish involves used clothing or particularly underwear, for example. Quite a common fetish can be at times getting sexually stimulated by underwear that's been used. I suppose there may be obvious reasons for that, why that is an attraction, but that can often be a real fetish that somebody will have. I think it's possible online. Some people will actually provide their used underwear at a cost, of course. Usually, anyway, I think so. Sometimes it's even shoes. For example, I know someone who's was only attracted to women in black shoes. I remember on one occasion him talking about seeing somebody coming down the stairs of a bus and thinking that this person was wearing black shoes, and he was beginning to become aroused sexually in some way. Then the light shone on them and he discovered they were actually brown shoes. Sexual interest went completely. And, that may seem unusual and strange to many people, but for him that was very real, and a real sexual fetish. Another fetish is towards sweaty body odour. For some people, obviously, that would be repulsive. For other people, it would be attractive. Again, wonder where that's coming from. Some people, going a stage further than that in a sense, are sexually stimulated by body excrement or urine in a way. Again, very often, people who have that kind of attraction are scrupulously clean themselves and would never think of wearing unclean underwear or anything like that. But nevertheless, there has become a sexual attraction to that. And I know in one particular person I know with that fetish can remember clearly as a child having an accident where he, as he would have put it, pooed in his pants, basically. And although part of him was embarrassed and ashamed by that, part of him felt a certain amount of comfort. I can identify that with a little bit, although it's never become sexualized for me personally, but I can remember as a child wetting the bed, and there was a mixture of emotions in very much the same way. There was a shame and an embarrassment, but also a little bit of comfort as well. And for some people, that will become sexualized. And in this particular person's life, it had become sexualized. Nobody else knew about it, but that was his secret, if you like, sexual attraction. Another common sexual fetish is for feet. Again, maybe some contact with this. It's it's the human odor of the feet that I think is partly attractive. The whole idea of it being a body part that can sometimes kind of smell in some way and therefore, be associated with the person whose foot it is, I guess. And that, again, is not an uncommon sexual fetish. And then there's the areas that are perhaps more familiar to us, like paedophilia, sexual attraction towards children. This, of course, was in our very sad case study of Simeon, where he had this problem, and it resulted in him committing suicide. And the sexual attraction towards children, in my experience, is often there in people who are in themselves have a childlike immaturity. That may not always be obvious. Some paedophiles will have all the trappings of maturity, maybe a successful job and so on. And yet, very often you can see the childlikeness that is often there. And that childlikeness or immaturity can often encourage the paedophile to make very foolish decisions, in terms of connecting with children and being with children, which often, of course, involve in them being arrested and so on. And I said before, that doesn't in any way, no matter how sympathetic we may be in terms of how the person has developed those feelings, nevertheless, it doesn't take away from the fact that it is still sexual abuse. When someone is making any kind of sexual advance or to a child. But in my experience, people with paedophile issues are usually, well, certainly in the people that I used to meet, many of them have never been involved in any sexual activity with children because they recognise that it's wrong, and therefore it's a very secret kind of feeling for them. Now, for others, of course, they will be involved in children. But when I've talked to people who are sexually attracted to children and said, in that sort of dynamic, are you wanting the child to please you sexually and emotionally, or do you want to please the child sexually and emotionally? And certainly in most of the cases that I've come across, most of the situations I've become aware of, the person has said, I want to please the child sexually. Because people who have sexual feelings for children very often, and again, not always, but very, very often, adore children. They want to be with children. They feel more comfortable with children than they do with adults. And so that often makes them gravitate towards work with children, for example. Thankfully, these days there are a lot of safeguards in place where that's less easy to do. But very often, the paedophile will adore children so much that they want to be with them. They will want to identify with them. And often, of course, they've been abused themselves as children. So, also, another thing needs to be said about paedophilia. It's often assumed to be a male issue, but of course, women can be paedophiles too. I think that's probably less common, but it is there. So I've certainly met women who have sexual feelings for children, and I've met people who've been sexually abused by women as children. So it's there in both sexes, not just in males. But it's very important to see where it comes from. Now, many people would say, well, is there nothing that can be done about that? Well, again, I wouldn't like to say that this can always happen, but I have come across some situations where, in a sense, the child in the adult who has sexual feelings towards children develops into more of a maturity. And so the sexual desires then seem to also go along with that maturity. So maybe that's something that sometimes can be worked at. But of course, I wouldn't like to say that that is always possible for people, but it's sometimes something that does happen, where the sexual feelings towards children can actually change and develop into more mature sexual feelings and desires. That can sometimes happen. Finally, transsexualism. Well, again, distinctly different to transvesticism, as we've already said. But of course, it's a sexual identity issue rather than a sexual feeling. And it's very often accompanied by a hatred of the body, especially the naked body, which doesn't conform to the perceived gender. So, for example, a transsexual man may see himself naked in the mirror with his genitalia and hate what he sees. He will find it repulsive. He would hate his genitalia. Likewise, a transsexual woman may experience the same kind of thing. And so, therefore, the obvious way of dealing with that for many people will be to have sex reassignment surgery so that the body can then conform to the mental and emotional image that the person has of who they really are. Again, sometimes it's possible to pinpoint things in their lives earlier on which could have led to this. Sometimes it's not. Certainly, most people I've met who would identify themselves as transgender or transsexual would say that they've had those feelings since childhood, since they were very young. And that's why, of course, sometimes it is considered to start the person on that road towards change very early on in their lives. But sometimes, of course, what happens is that particularly with the male to female change, sometimes the person still has some male bone structure and body structure. So it's less easy to totally convince other people that you are really a woman, even though, of course, you feel that you are a woman. And in those cases, very often the person, rather than saying, I'm now a woman, will probably instead say, I'm transgender. And again, I can understand why, in a sense, because that helps the person to feel, I think it helps the person's self-worth and self-value to identify themselves in that way. But in some cases, of course, it would be almost impossible to tell that the person had once been of the former gender identity in their bodies. I think particularly for women who change, it seems to me anyway to be much easier to do that successfully in terms of the image that they then present, because if the woman starts taking male hormones, for example, in order to transgender towards being male, then may also grow a beard and lose hair and so on. So would be stereotypically much more having a male appearance, if you understand what I mean. I hope I'm expressing this in a sensitive way and not offending anyone by what I'm saying. But it's a very difficult position to be in for many people. Obviously, social attitudes are changing, and so it's better than it used to be, I think, in that sense. But at one time, it was said that the suicide rate was the highest amongst transsexual people than any other group of people. But now, of course, it's included along with the lesbian, gay, and transgender. You know, it's included in the same desire to find acceptance and so on. So that's transsexualism. Well, I've only scratched the surface, haven't I, of these different issues. But just to finally conclude, we all have unique sexual feelings and attractions, as I said right at the very beginning. It's like a fingerprint. It's unique to us. I wonder how you feel about what's been shared. Sometimes maybe it will make you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes you're not happy about it. Sometimes maybe you don't think we should be discussing these kind of issues. I've already argued why I think it's important, for us to look at these kind of issues. But maybe some of you are not happy about that. Maybe for some of you it's thrown up some unpleasant memories and some difficult situations. And of course, in those cases, as I said in our second session, very important that you should go and get some kind of help and support. So, for some final words from Jesus, who says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." So whatever your sexuality, whatever you're struggling with or not struggling with in terms of your sexuality, whether you're a Christian or not, please know that God loves you. And he not only loves you in a sense of giving his life for you, which of course he did through the Lord Jesus, so that you might be forgiven, but he also loves you in terms of understanding everything about you, understanding exactly how you're feeling, exactly what is going on right now, as he has for the whole of your life, right from the beginning, because he's written your story, because you're created by him. So as we're learning to love, and that's a process I think that all of us are going through in our lives, as we're learning to love, please know that you are loved.